Hi, this is Andrew Smith, instructor at Ferris State University and runner of artbysmitty.com. Today we're going to be going over how to create a next-gen asset. We're going to make a barrel, and the first thing we're going to do is create the high poly. So I go to my Create tab, enter box, and create the first object that's going to be a plank of wood that makes up this barrel. Hit J to get rid of that. Hit F4 to enable edge mode. I'm going to hit M on the keyboard, material. I'm going to select the first one and call this one just a standard gray and apply this to my object. I'm also going to go to the Modify tab, change the color to black. That's just a personal preference. First thing I'm going to do is right click, say Convert to Editable Poly. Next, I hit 2 on the keyboard to enter edge mode, edge subobject mode. Select all of my edges and say chamfer. I'm going to say chamfer amount something like 0.35 and hit OK. Next thing I'm going to do is select an edge running along the long horizontal edge here. Hit Alt R for ring selection, or I can hit ring over here. I'm going to right click and say connect settings box. And now I can say let's move up these segments until I have like evenly spaced squares or faces on the top of this. I do that because if I were to bring this in ZBrush, I could sculpt on these areas evenly. And the sculpting I do over here is the same as over here because the polygons are same height and width. So next thing I'm going to do is get out of sub-object mode, deselect, select my object again, and now apply Turbo Smooth. And now collapse all, hit yes. I'm going to name this plank underscore 001. Hit enter, and now I'm going to select this plank, hit Z to zoom on it, hit W for move translation, and move it in the x-axis just until I get a nice little opening there. Not too much though. I'll say number of copies 17, hit OK, and now you can see I have a line of planks of wood that we're going to make up with this barrel. I'm going to apply bend modifier to all these later and make it circular. This is the same way I'd go about making a tread for a tire. I'd model the tread flat and then just add a bend modifier to it later. So now if I hit H on my keyboard, you can see it has all my planks labeled correctly. Make sure you label everything. So I'm going to come in here and I'm just going to grab a few of these planks, move them down, a few of them, and then after that maybe I'll adjust some of their size as well, just to add some randomness to these planks. If we're making a barrel, maybe some drunken bartender way back in the day of pirates or castles put this together, and it's not going to be perfect. So randomness is not only in nature but also in early man-made objects, or objects that are not technical and machine built or fabricated. So if I hit F4 and turn off wireframe, you can see I have a little bit more variation going on here, some different shading, and that's just adding an artistic touch to this. So I'm going to select the first one, and it turned it to an editable mesh, so I'm going to say convert to editable poly. I always work in edit poly mode, never edit mesh or anything like that. I'm not going to lie, I don't really know the differences too much, but I do know that there's different settings over here depending on if you have editable mesh, editable poly, and I changed it to editable poly because I want to hit the attach settings box. And now I can select all my planks here and hit attach. So now they're all in one object, and now they're just separate elements. Okay, so next thing I'm going to do is hit T for top, Z to zoom on this, and we want to add some metal pieces, some metal bands that will be actually tying this together, holding this wood together. So I'm going to hit Z to zoom on it. I'm going to scale it down a bit because metal sheet like this might be a little bit thin, so they could actually bend it. If it was too thick, it'd be too hard to bend. Okay, so I'm going to apply my standard material to it. I'm going to name this metal strap 001, and now I'm going to convert it to editable poly. Hit 2 on my keyboard, select all the edges, or I could just hit Control A, and now I'm going to apply chamfer. This chamfer is going to be very small, like 0.1. Hit OK, because metal is going to have a really hard edge, unlike the wood that has a softer edge. Metal's, man-forged. Wood is forged by nature, hence the differences in chamfered edges. Next thing I'm going to do is select one of these edges, hit Alt-R, ring it, right-click, and connect, and change the segments until they're somewhat decently squared. These squared faces will also help in making sure this turbo smooths correctly. I'm going to go hit T for top, Z to zoom, and go to vert mode by hitting 1 and move these verts in so they're not extending past the wood when we bend this. Go back into perspective mode, get out of sub-object mode, and change this color to black. I'm going to hold shift, move it in the Y direction down, hit OK. And because these metal straps need to be everywhere, and maybe there's another metal strap down here at the bottom, and it's slightly thinner, just for extra support. I'm not really quite sure how to actually build these barrel kegs, but I'm sure extra metal straps are not a bad thing. So let's select this guy, hit the attach button, and attach all of these other straps. Hit OK. And now we have metal straps and wood. Very nice. Next thing I'm going to do is go and create a box. I'm going to say, okay, I want to go to my Modify tab now and say 5 by 5 by 5, and length, width, and height segment, something like, maybe 6 by 6 by 6, and convert to editable poly. Now, what we want to do next is, well, first apply that standard shader and make it black. And I'm going to get out of that. I accidentally hit something up here. I don't like that thing. You shouldn't be using that. I don't really know many professional artists that do use that. Mostly students will use this to navigate. So anyway, one thing that I'm going to do is I want this to be like kind of like a screw, or like a bolt that bolts into this metal, because this metal has to be held into this wood somehow, connected to it. So obviously they would use these metal nails or screws and bang them down into the wood. So in order to make this look like one, I'm just going to do this really quick and say, let's go apply a spherify modifier to it. And spherify makes it a sphere. And you can change these parameters here accordingly. I actually put a slight spherify sometimes on characters that I'm using just to give them a interesting look. It can be a very powerful plugin, or modifier, sorry, and that's my favorite modifier. As an artist, I use it quite a bit. And actually, I used to work at the University of Michigan 3D lab, and apparently one of the guys that works at U of M created that spherify modifier, so I thought that was awesome. I never got to meet him, but I would love to. So I'm going to, now this is editable poly, I'm going to hit 5, select this element, and come down and change all the smoothing groups, because it has a bunch of different ones already, and I'm just going to put them all in one, so this is a nice smooth sphere. As artists, you could probably go in and actually model bolts in higher detail, but I'm going to save you guys the torture and make this tutorial as quick as I can. I don't want to waste your time. Same thing with this high poly. I could take this in a ZBrush and sculpt some wood and some metal edges on it, but again, I'll leave that to you guys. You guys are the artists. Okay, so I'll select this bolt, and I need to rename it. Bolt underscore 001. Okay. And now I'm going to go T for top, Z to zoom on it, and say this is bolted every, 4 or 5. And we'll just say number of copies 6. Okay. So, and then I'm just going to move this last guy in a bit, so it's not hanging over the edge. I'll select this guy, shift click him down here, and I'll move this one over to about the middle of the next one and say number of copies 17. And hit OK. This guy needs to be, some of these guys are in the cracks, which, you would want to go and move as artists, so it makes sense. But again, I'm not going to do this to all. Use your best judgment as artists. Next thing I'm going to do is hit H on the keyboard. Well, first, let's go ahead and just select a bolt and say Attach Settings, and select all these bolts, since we labeled them. Very easy when you name things, put things in correct layers, etc. So we have a little bit different pattern going on at the bottom as opposed to the top. Very nice. So next thing I'm going to do is attach this all. Well, first, let's apply Turbo Smooth to this guy, because he's looking a little low poly, and collapse all that. Change it from editable mesh to editable poly, just for the heck of it. Good practice. Attach these wood planks, and what I'm going to do is actually move them down, and this will be the bottom of our barrel. So I'm going to call this bottom, hit enter, and I'm going to call this one barrel. So now what we need to do is attach all this high poly stuff. So I'm going to select him, attach settings box, and select everything but the bottom. Hit attach. So this is now one object. I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to go to the hierarchy menu, effect pivot only, center to object, and I'm going to rotate it with snap toggle on at 90 degrees. So it's sitting vertically. Okay, I'm going to now hit the move and make sure this is centered in my scene at the origin at 0, 0, 0. I can do the same for this bottom piece, effective pivot only, center to object, and we want its x and y to be 0. The z is fine about here, maybe a little bit down more. Okay, and now comes my favorite part. We'll go ahead and come over here and apply a bend modifier in the x and say 360 degrees. Okay, very cool. If I hit F4, turn off my grid, this looks like a bucket, not a barrel. So let's go back. I'm just hitting G to hide my grid and F4 for the wireframe. Select this guy, and now again we're going to apply my favorite modifier to this. A slight spherify at something, say, let's go with 45%. Hit OK. And one little side note, this isn't part of the process, you don't have to follow along, but if I come down here to my bend modifier and go to gizmo, if you were to animate something cool, you can actually animate this gizmo and get some really cool looking effects. So check that out, play with it if you're into animating. You could do some really cool stuff with these modifiers. And I just found that out by playing around with it the other day in class. So let's go ahead and just say collapse all. Yes. Okay, this barrel, it kind of looks a little funky, but as artists, you guys can play around with this and make it look more like a barrel as opposed to what I'm doing. I'm not going to waste your time nitpicking this and making it look perfect. So let's hit move and go back to hierarchy and move our pivot point to the middle, center of object. And now move this guy to 0, 0, 0 again. Okay. Now we need to build the tops and bottoms of this barrel, so I'm going to select this wood down here at the bottom. I'm going to apply another turbo smooth modifier to it. Say collapse all, yes, and hit B for bottom, Z to zoom, and I'm going to come up here and change my selection from this square marquee to a lasso tool, and I'm actually going to come in here and select all the faces that are extruding outside the bounds of this barrel. Whoops, and I actually need to be in change this to editable poly and hit 4 for face mode, and now I can come in here and select these faces. Delete. Delete. Don't right click when you're selecting. My mouse is very sensitive. Okay, delete. And I have a few faces here coming out the side. And I'll just say delete on those. Again, this is a part of the process. You can see I have, go back into perspective view, I have some faces that aren't quite reaching into the mesh of the high poly barrel here. So I would actually come in here and grab all these edges and move them so they were penetrating that. But again, I'm not going to waste your time doing that. I'll let you guys do that on your own. So let's go ahead and say, select this guy. Maybe we move him down a little bit so it does intersect some of these edges. And I'm going to say, okay, effect pivot only, center to object, and then also I'm going to move it to 0, 0, 0. So it's in the middle of our origin. Next thing I'm going to do is mirror this in the z-axis as a copy. Hit OK, and now I have a top and a bottom. And now what I want to do is select this barrel and attach everything in my scene. Hit attach, and now I'm going to name this guy barrel underscore high poly. So I just built my high poly mesh. I might even scale him down a bit to make it look more like a barrel. You don't want you kind of want to not do that, because now look at my bolts. They're scrunched down too, which is not the effect I wanted. But again, you guys are the artists. Go and play with that and make it look better. Okay. So I have a high poly, and now the goal next is to build the low poly. Now if this was a character or a very complex object, I would use a program like TopoGun or 3D Coat to literally bring this into that program and draw my high poly or my low poly mesh right on the surface of this guy, creating my own low poly geometry and edge flow. But since this is such a simple object, this basically looks like, from far away, looks like a cylinder that's been bloated in the middle. So I can actually just come in here and create a low poly by going to Create, Cylinder, and I'm going to create a cylinder in my scene about here. Hit F4 to get my edges, and go to Modify and say Sides. Let's go with 10 sides, and let's go with 4 height segments. Something, fairly low poly, something that would be in our game. Because this isn't very important object. It's probably just a barrel sitting in the corner of some bar or town village or something. So it doesn't need a whole lot of polygons in the low poly here. I'm going to go to Material and just apply that standard material to it. I'm going to change the color to something like red. So now I can tell the difference between my low poly and high poly, because they're going to be very similar in size. I'm going to move this to the origin of my scene. I'm going to say go to Modify or Hierarchy tab and say Effect Pivot Only, Centered Object. And now I'm going to move this down to the middle. So now both of my objects are at 0, 0, 0. I'm going to hit F for front, Z to zoom, hit Alt X for wireframe. Actually, I won't do that. I'll select this guy. Right click, convert to editable poly. Now I'm going to go into vert mode, and I'm going to get my square marquee tool back and select these edges and just start lining this up as best I can. The idea is to cover, the basic shape of this high poly barrel with these vertices. Move these guys up a bit. And I want my next layer of verts about here. And maybe these guys can get moved down a bit too. Idea is keeping this low poly object, thinking about its silhouette and making sure its silhouette is nice and round. Might be a little bit pointy here, but that's because the high poly barrel is so bloated in the middle. I probably would have changed that before. So I'm going to go into perspective mode and select this low poly mesh, hit 4 for faces, and I'm going to hit bevel, accept 0 height, and move it in about here, hit OK, and now I want to extrude this, except negatively. So I can catch these planks here in the bottom, and I'll do the same to the bottom. Now this saves my settings, so I just have to say extrude, actually bevel first, hit OK, extrude next, and we'll move this down a little, or up a little bit, hit OK. And now our low poly barrel is taking the same shape as the high poly. Again, when you're baking things, because that's what we're doing, is we're going to preparing this to bake. I'm going to hit 4 for face mode or polygon mode, depending on what program you're working in. And I'm going to come down here and make sure all my smoothing groups, so these faces are 1. Everything's got to be on the same smoothing group when I'm baking out normals. So hopefully you're not skipping around this tutorial and you're actually listening to it and catching these key steps in the process. Okay, next we need to, in order to actually project the information from the high poly to the low poly through 3ds Max baking, we need to have this object unwrapped correctly. So I'm going to apply unwrap UVW modifier to it. And again, here's my modifier sets. If you want to create your own, come here and say, mine is called Smitty, but you can go and configure modifier sets and create your own. Sometimes I create different modifier sets for different things like rendering, texturing, or modeling, etc. So I'm going to say edit. I'm using Max 2011. If you're using 2012, it may look different. It's got pretty much all the same buttons, but they just look different. So I'm going to say mapping, flat mapping, just so I can see all my objects here, and just move those guys outside of the UV space area. I'm going to select everything one more time, and I'm going to come in here and say I want to do a cylindrical unwrap, except it gives me this craziness. So I'm going to say best align. Okay. So now I can come here, hit checkered, and I can see these checkers now. My UVs is stretched, so I just have to come in here and scale this guy down appropriately until I get my checkerboards, pretty much square. So that looks good. There's a little bit of stretching on the sides and the corners here, but we'll deal with that. That's what baking's for. Baking is a great way to avoid these textures stretching. So next thing I'm going to do is come in here in 3D space and select all these faces on the top, because these are not unwrapped correctly. I'm going to say planar, best align, and come in here in my UV space and just move them down so the squares on top here are about the same as the squares on the bottom. The reason being, if I'm painting a texture in Photoshop or applying a texture overlay, if I paint here and I paint the same brush stroke here, I want to make sure that the line in 3D shows up the same. If this guy here was huge and I painted a stroke, then it would be much smaller than compared to if I stroked all the way down to here, because they're not the same density. So that's my method behind this. I'll do the same to the bottom here. Keep in mind, I'm doing a very quick unwrap here. It's not perfect. It's a lot of wasted UV space. But again, I'm not going to bore you guys. This tutorial isn't about unwrapping. There's plenty of them on YouTube or Google. I'm just doing a basic, quick introduction, I guess you could say, to unwrapping. And I'll say planar, best align. And I'll make this roughly the same size as the other one. And okay, so that looks like a good unwrap. You'll notice here these green lines show up where seams are. That means just these verts are not welded together. So I'll say options or display, show vertex connections, go back to options, go to preferences, and weld threshold all the way up to 10. And now when I select a vert, it shows the corresponding vert. And now I can right click, weld selected, weld selected, weld selected. Now these are welded, and my seams are only on the outside, which is very nice. So I'm going to close this out, hit collapse all. That collapses all that UV information into the low poly mesh. And now I'm ready for baking. So let's select the low poly, hit 0 on our keyboard, or we could go to rendering, wait for this to load. Okay, I could go to rendering and I could say render to texture, or the hotkey 0. So let's enable projection mapping, pick our high poly barrel, and it tries to, notice it puts a projection modifier on our low poly, but the cage is all whack. It tries to basically do it itself as best it can, but it never works. So next thing we want to do is hit F10, or I could go to rendering, render setup. Now what I want to do is scroll down, and I usually have mental ray locked in as my default, but we want scanline when we're rendering out or baking normals. So I'm going to say options, setup, enable max 2.5 star global super sampler, close these out, make sure use existing channel 1 is on, don't use automatic unwrap because we just spent a little bit of time unwrapping this guy. And now I want to go add and say normals map, add elements, and come down here and tell it to save it to my desktop by clicking this button here. And wait for Max to catch up. I'm going to now save this to my desktop. Hit save. We went 24-bit. If we hit 32, then we could export alphas, but we don't need that. I'll say 512 is good for this. And I'm going to say, I would say render. We're ready to render, except our cage is all messed up. So I'm going to come to the projection modifier and go down to the cage. Hit cage here, hit shaded, and hit reset. Now it snaps that cage right back to the low poly. And now we can adjust the amount, not percent, amount, until this cage is covering all the high poly. Which, if you click shaded, it'll normally shade this, but with Camtasia active right now, it's not doing it for some reason. Camtasia is my recording program, so please keep that in mind. Now I can say render, hit continue, and it's going to render the materials that we applied to it, so don't worry about that. Because if I were to take this target that I saved out to my desktop, it actually looks like this. And you can see my cage right here is actually not covering the high poly in some areas, so I need to go back to max and make this cage come out even more. And now hit render. Yes. Yes, overwrite. And now if I render this and reopen this Targa and update, those go away. I'm getting some errors here because there's actually no geometry here that the cage is capturing. Remember, we left little cracks. That's stuff you can paint out in Photoshop here. And again, remember, I didn't spend a lot of time unwrapping around here, these edges here, so we're getting errors here again. But again, I don't want to bore you guys with the little nitpicky details like that. This is basically a tutorial, so you guys can just quick go through and start making your own props and assets for next-gen games. Okay, so we just rendered out our normal maps, but let's go in here and deselect our low poly and select our high poly and say hide unselected. Now what we want to also do is we can use baking in Max for all kinds of things, not just normal maps. We can render out things like complete maps. We can render out just diffuse color, which is what we want to do next, just to get your diffuse maps going a little bit. So what I'm going to do next is hit M for material and come in here and create a new one, call this one wood, and the next one will be metal. Metal is going to be kind of glossy, and I'm going to say this color has a slight blue tint to it, and it's going to be very light. Hit OK. And the wood texture is going to be brown. Maybe a very desaturated dark brown. Hit OK. Okay, so now if I select this and hit 5 for element mode, I can select all of my pieces of wood, apply this wood texture to it. So let's come in here and select these top pieces, apply the wood texture to those, and do the same down here. Click and drag. Okay, now I'm going to select these pieces of metal and apply the metal to it. I would go and select all these little spheres for the nuts and bolts, but again, I'm going to spare you guys the torture, try and get this tutorial done quickly. So next thing I can do is click unhide all, come in here, get out of subobject mode, select my low poly, and delete that. Remember how we added the normal map here? Well, I'm going to delete that and hit add again. And now this time, instead of normal map, I want to hit diffuse map. Hit add elements. I'm going to tell it to, don't save it here, save it to my desktop. I wish it would default to that. Hit OK. Again, 512 by 512. And now if I hit render, yeah, it's doing the shading here in the render preview, exactly how my shading is here in the 3D space. But if I open this diffuse map in Photoshop, it's actually going to give me everything just the diffuse. So I got my gray for the metal, and I got my brown for the bolts in metal, or brown for the wood. I don't know if I said metal or not, but this is a great way to get a start on my diffuse maps. I can even take this normal map, run it through Crazy Bump, get an ambient occlusion, and apply this as a multiply layer here on my diffuse and get some nice shading here in the corners. But unfortunately, I don't have Crazy Bump on this machine. I have it on all my other machines, but the one I do tutorials on, I do not have it yet. So I apologize. So let's try and just do something really quick here. I have a wood texture on my desktop. I'll drag that in here, hit Control A, Control C, and Control V here to paste it in. It's very large, so I'm just going to say scale this guy down a bit. And I want to rotate it so the wood is facing the same way my wood is on my barrel. That's good enough. I'll hit something like overlay. Again, you guys would spend more time painting your diffuse map here, obviously, or hand painting it. I prefer hand painting and subtle overlays like this with textures. I'm going to hit Control S to save this to my desktop. I guess I'll just save this as a PSD. I'll come back into Max, and I'm going to delete my projection modifier. I will hide my high poly, and I'll come in here and hit M, and go to the second material slot, say, barrel, next gen, and apply this to the barrel. I'm going to come in here, say maps, bump map at 100. Go to none, and we want a normal. Hit OK, And here we want a bitmap, the top slot. I will go find my normal map, which I saved to my desktop, which is here. Hit open. I want also diffuse map by going to bitmap. Okay, and I will select my PSD. Hit OK. Yes, collapse layers is fine. Save me on memory. And I'll say show in viewport. And now if I were to hit render, I have this next gen barrel in my scene. If I get rid of the diffuse and just render out the normals, you can see here's a good start on my normal map. Again, this is very rushed, and just to kind of show you guys how to do these things. Okay, Auxilial shader is giving me errors, but don't worry about that. So now if I come in here, I can see lights actually interacting with this normal map, casting shadows, giving me interesting things. So it's pretty cool I can get this object here from this level of geometry here. So I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial on creating a next-gen asset. Obviously I didn't take it all the way. The next steps would be creating having more time with my normal and my diffuse map in Photoshop, correcting them, and also creating a spec map where the wood would not have much specularity and the metal would have very sharp specularity, very high specularity. So the spec on the wood would be almost black, and the spec on the metal would be almost white with a bunch of scratches on it, so that when this light hits it, remember specularities is only adding details to your objects. It should not just be a desaturated version of your diffuse map. Very similar to the additive layer inside of Photoshop. So whatever details you would like to add to your texture maps when light shines on it, usually my spec map is completely different than my diffuse map. It has scratches, it has stains, it has all kinds of stuff in it. And that's how the objects, especially metal, reacts in real life. If you think about a football helmet that's been scratched and beat up, maybe it looks different when you shine a light on it than if it's just an ambient lighting. If you shine a flashlight on this football helmet, you'll see all kinds of scratches and dents that you wouldn't otherwise see. So that's how specularity works. Again, go to Polycount's wiki and you can read all about that. I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial. Thank you for watching.